After last week's cruise missile strike on an air base in Syria, this weekend was relatively quiet. There were rumblings, diplomatic rumblings, concerning news coming out, but no further action, at least that was made clear to us. There are some rumors about the death of one of the Syrian pilots who flew the mission. I don't believe that those are confirmed at this point, but it doesn't seem like there were any additional strikes, at least against Assad regime material or bases. And so now we're left wondering, what are the next steps? I mean, they've said that there's likely to be further action. We know that Russia is saying that there will be consequences for what we did. But Donald Trump doesn't seem to be making clear what he's going to do. And so we're left looking at some of his most high-profile foreign policy representatives, and even they don't seem to know exactly what's going to happen now. So here we're gonna have Nikki Haley, ambassador to the UN, and she makes pretty clear that there are going to be extremely large consequences for the Assad regime.
Is regime change in Syria now the official policy of the United States?
So there's multiple priorities. It's getting Assad out is not the only priority. And so what we're trying to do is obviously defeat ISIS. Secondly, we don't see a peaceful Syria with Assad in there. Thirdly, get the Iranian influence out. And then finally move towards a political solution, because at the end of the day, this is a complicated situation. There are no easy answers, and a political solution is going to have to happen. But we know that it is not going to be, there's not any sort of option where a political solution is going to happen with Assad at the head of the regime.
But is the position of the Trump administration that he cannot be ruler of Syria anymore? Regime change is the policy.
Well, the regime change is something that we think is going to happen, because all of the parties are going to see that Assad's not the leader that needs to be taking place for Syria. So what I think you're seeing is this isn't about policy or not. This is about thoughts. And so when you look at the thoughts, there is no political solution that any of us can see with Assad at the lead.
Okay, so that at the very least is true. You don't simply have a political solution. They keep throwing that around because they want you to be focused on the political solution rather than the military attempts to solve the problem that they've already started and might continue as well. Obviously, there's no political solution without a military solution. That's why he's been engaged in this civil war for half a decade now at this point. But if you're worried about escalation of our conflict against the Syrian regime, I mean, she made very clear it's going to happen.
Right.
Now, devil's advocate, she could be alluding to the fact that if we can convince Russia, then Russia can take him out. Good luck with that.
Right. I mean, Russia has no incentive to take him out. Right now, Russia is one of Assad's allies, okay? And Russia took part in specifically going after civilians in this really brutal war. So I don't believe in a second, or for a second, that Russia would take any part in getting Assad out or playing a role in regime change. But the most important thing to take away from that interview was that Nikki Haley believes that the Trump administration is going to push for regime change. And so right now there's a lot of confusion about what Trump's strategy is, because he went from criticizing the Obama administration several years ago and claiming that Obama should not under any circumstance get involved in what was happening in Syria. And then he seemed to take a very, I wouldn't say favorable, but he seemed like he was very much in favor of focusing on America, not getting involved in the Syrian conflict. And then out of nowhere, because he saw the chemical attack videos, he decided, okay, no, we got to do something, and then proceeds to do the missile strike. So what is the strategy? What happens next? What kind of impact has his action taken so far? And what does everyone else in his administration say right now? She's the UN ambassador, right? But now we're about to hear from someone else who has a very different take on what the administration is planning on doing.
Yeah, so why don't we turn now to Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who is going to disagree with Nikki Haley in fairly fundamental fashion on what needs to happen going forward.
Well, I think those continued actions by Bashar al-Assad clearly call into any question of him expecting to have any legitimacy to continue as the leader of Syria. I think the issue of how Bashar al-Assad's leadership is sustained or how he departs is something that we will be working with allies and others in the coalition.
Is it a priority of US policy to get him out of power?
Our priority in Syria, John, really hasn't changed. I think the president's been quite clear. First and foremost, we must defeat ISIS.
So in terms of President Assad, you had said that there has been no change in policy as a result of this attack. So it is still true then that his fate is to be determined, as you said previously, by the Syrian people.
Yes, John, I think, obviously the United States' own founding principles are self-determination. And I think what the United States and our allies want to do is to enable the Syrian people to make that determination. Now, we've seen what violent regime change looks like in Libya, and the kind of chaos that can be unleashed, and indeed the kind of misery that it enacts on its own people. It's important that we keep our priorities straight, and we believe that the first priority is the defeat of ISIS.
And just to be clear, before we go a bit wider, I mean, they're talking about whether it should be up to the Syrian people to decide their fate, which is fine, and we love to speak in those terms. But let's be clear at this point, there might have been a narrow window at one point where the Syrian people were engaged in an attempt to either politically change the regime, eventually starting the civil war, but not too long after that, just a few years after that, their ability to do it all on their own was taken away, and not just because of the brutal actions of Assad, but also the wide-scale intervention by Russia, the fact that they began supporting him militarily and also economically. So at that point, it becomes a fiction to say that the Syrian people get to decide. Well, yes, technically against Assad, who's crushing them militarily, and one of the most powerful military forces around the globe. So technically they get to decide. But anyway, there he's saying the policy hasn't actually changed.
Right, he's saying.
Has he spoken to Nikki Haley?
That's the thing.
Has she spoken to Trump?
But that's exactly the right question to ask, because even within his administration, you see different messaging from different people. And you'll see them go on cable news, do these interviews, and further confuse the American people about what Trump's strategy, if there is any strategy, will be and how he'll proceed forward. It seems like things happen very spontaneously, and that's a very dangerous way to go about Syria, which, by the way, I concede is one of the most difficult foreign policy issues facing the world today. I don't know what the proper measures are, right? I know that what Trump did with the missiles last week was not effective. It didn't accomplish anything. If anything, it escalated conflict in a way that was haphazard and wasn't well thought out. But it's important to understand all the different factions that play a role in Syria. It's not just the rebels, Assad. Whose side are you on? No, it's much more complicated than that. There are, various countries that have decided to ally themselves with either Assad or the rebels. Then you have,
or the terrorist groups.
Or the terrorist groups, exactly. And so there's so many players here, and I'm not convinced that someone like Trump is sophisticated enough to understand the nuances of this civil war, understand all the players, and I also don't have faith in Trump in terms of uniting all the people that are supposed to be collaborating with him, advising him, and essentially getting briefed effectively enough to make a smart decision. So right now, as you can see from these two different interviews, you have two different theories on how the Trump administration should move forward, and I have no idea what's going to happen. Everything seems very spontaneous, and there's no, uniting front within the Trump administration.
It seems like they don't know either, and that seems crazy to say. But do we have any reason to believe that Trump has actually sat down and spoken, or gotten on the phone and spoken with either Tillerson or Nikki Haley? Especially Nikki Haley. We don't have that. Like I agree, Trump isn't sophisticated enough to understand the situation in Russia, and he's not curious enough to find out about it, even after we've engaged with the Assad regime. And so, look, my fear immediately after the missiles were launched late last Thursday was that he will see this as a great opportunity to get us embroiled in a military conflict, which unfortunately the media will probably largely back him on. The people, the American people, historically have been very supportive of presidents during a time of war, especially if the danger of that enemy is hyped up to them. And we already know that in a recent poll, 51% of the American public supports the military strikes against Syria, which is not; those are not incredible numbers. And you're seeing a weird mix of Republicans and Democrats supporting that there. And that option is still possible. I mean, we could find out, that we've sent in 10,000 troops tomorrow. Trump has said that he will not tell us until afterward when he engages in those sorts of actions. But there is a lot of danger in that path. I mean, something could happen with Russia, US troops could be lost, and that's damaging to him too. So it's not impossible at this point that he'll take the small boost to his approval that he's already gotten. People saying that he looks presidential, and look, he'll do decisive action, and he might actually back off, especially considering how disinterested he is in Syria to begin with.
Can I please jump in with this whole notion that President Trump looks more presidential because of what he did? If acting based on emotion and acting in a spontaneous fashion without getting the proper briefings necessary from intelligence organizations is what makes you appear presidential, then we have extremely low standards in this country for what presidential means, right? Anyone who went on television and supported this and thought it was a good idea is a questionable commentator, to say the least, right? And look, everyone makes mistakes in their commentary and their analysis of the news, so I'm not trying to be too judgy about it. But I just want to be clear, right now, what's happening in Syria and this escalation by the Trump administration will have significant costs. And who knows where it will lead? Who knows how many members of our military will have to get involved in a situation that wasn't well thought out, right? And so this is not presidential. It's kind of like being on a high school campus and seeing a bully throw the first punch, and then someone says, that's what a real student does. That student looks like a real student.
No,
what does that even mean?
That guy looks student body presidential.
Yeah, that student body presidential because he took a strong action or strong act. Like, this is not presidential to me. Presidential is showing leadership, showing that you are properly equipped with the knowledge necessary to make a smart decision. And in this case, it did not seem like a smart decision. Trump himself said, I saw those videos, and he got emotional and he made a decision based on that. That is not presidential.
Yeah, well, it's easy to get away with that sort of thing when the vast majority of Trump supporters were polled and they said that this is consistent with his past statements on what should happen in Syria. And we've shown you over and over the many quotes, both in video form, his 13 tweets attacking Obama for possibly getting involved in Syria. I mean, this is the political context that we exist in. And I think that he is aware of how little memory there is amongst his supporters, how little interest there is in consistency amongst his supporters. Thankfully, our audience is a little bit more self-aware than that. And I don't know where it's gonna go from here. There's some rumblings, some rumors about further developments coming out today. An unnamed military official, so that's always a good beginning to a sentence, saying that they have now confirmed that Russia was aware of the chemical attack before it happened.
Yeah.
They haven't gone on record, they haven't presented the evidence. At this point, there's no reason to believe that, but that is now out there. Is that something that Trump is going to run with? Are they going to present evidence? I have no idea. It might be on tomorrow's show.
And one final thing that I wanted to comment on, I know we've gone too long. So I just find it fascinating that members of Congress did not make a big deal about the fact that they were not notified about what Trump was about to do, right? So Trump is able to act unilaterally if a country poses an imminent threat to the United States. We all know that Syria did not pose an imminent threat to the United States, but again, he acted unilaterally in what he did. And so if any other president, let's say President Hillary Clinton, had done the exact same thing that Trump did without notifying Congress, without asking them for their advice, their opinion, their support, I feel like Congress would be speaking or singing a very different tune right now, okay? So
I think even more Democrats would be backing her up, even though a lot of Democrats backed up Trump on the strikes, elected Democrats I'm talking about. I think fewer Republicans would, but I bet some would.
I'm sure some would, but
they still want that money going to the defense contractors. I think that that's one of the few bipartisan issues in DC. Start a war, people are gonna get paid, both the defense contractors and then you through them are going to get paid. I think she could reach across the aisle with some strikes on Syria.
She probably could, but I just want to really emphasize how deeply everything is politicized right now and how polarized Congress is, or not just Congress, politics in general in the United States, but in Congress and the executive branch. And I just feel like Republicans would make such a big deal out of a Democratic leader acting unilaterally in a similar situation. Just want to put that out there. I could be wrong, that's just speculation.
You're probably right, I mean they did it with Obama. Including Trump, by the way.
We're not the Young Turks, you're the Young Turks. You power this show. Together, we built something amazing. We've broken stories like the Donna Brazil story the mainstream media wouldn't break. We built the studio, we built this network. It's now #1, all thanks to you guys. Let's come build it even bigger and stronger. TYTnetwork.com/join.